Welcome everyone to the 2024 Elizabeth and Irwin Warren Folk Art Symposium. The picture is still out there, reframing Black presence in the collection of early American art and material culture. Thank you for joining us across time zones today. I'm Mathilde Walker-Bio, Curator of Programming at the American Folk Art Museum. A quick note that closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. I'm joining you today from Queens, New York. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenapehoking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. As many of you know, affirm is dedicated to the work of self-taught artists across time and place. Next slide, please. And we are very thrilled to offer new perspectives on early American art and material culture with the exhibition Unnamed Figures, Black Presence and Absence in the Early American North, now on view at 2 Lincoln Square until March 24th, along the concurrent exhibition Marvels of My Own Inventiveness. Unnamed Figures, Black Presence and Absence in the Early American North share the untold stories of Black experience in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, from the late 17th century to the antebellum, through a large range of media, including painted portraits and landscapes, needleworks, works on paper, sculptures, photographs, and other vernacular forms. Curators Emily J. Volt and Dr. Arwel Watson and Shade Ayorinde actively chose to refocus their attention on Black subjects to center interpretation on those who have been omitted and erased from public history. The Elizabeth and Irwin Warren Folk Art Symposiums uses the research behind the making of this exhibition as a platform for broader consideration of museum and institutional practices in relation to folk art, early American history, and issues of anti-Black racism. Next slide. Part of its title is the phrase, "The picture is still out there." It refers to Toni Morrison's concept of rememory. In her novel Beloved, the writer grapples with the aftermath of slavery. She meditates on how traumatic pasts live in the present and take on pictorial forms. One of her characters says, "Even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there." So this symposium gathers scholars and curators who have embraced these ideas of a surviving past by considering images, objects, and material culture as manifestations of historical events and experiences, as material witnesses that prompt us to remember. Next slide. Featuring 2 conversations and 2 panel discussions taking place Friday, February 23rd, and today, the symposium shares methods of preserving, acquiring, interpreting, and exhibiting early American material culture that address histories of colonialism and racism, while discussing ways to acknowledge and recognize the steady presence and creativity of African Americans in history. So today we're closing the symposium with our second part. And as you can note in the schedule, we will begin the day with a panel Remembering Early American History, featuring archaeologist Alexandra Chan, political theorist Mark Roth, and public historian Dr. Tiffany Momon, introduced and moderated by Dr. Jill von Rothschild. So following this panel, there will be a 30-minute break, and we resume the program at 1:30 p.m. with our closing conversation, revisiting the exhibition Unnamed Figures, Black Presence and Absence in the Early American North, with exhibition curators Emily J. Bolt, Dr. Arwel Watson, and Shade Ayorinde. And you can submit your questions in the Q&A feature, as there will be time for questions at the end of each session. And we'll make every effort to get to as many as possible. I'll be using the chat room to share more details about the program, the speaker, and if you need any additional information, please drop me a line. Today's program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. We wish to thank the Warren family for their generous support of this symposium and making these 2 days of scholarship possible. And I hope you will consider supporting our program through donation to the museum following this symposium. Your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of self-taught artists and folk artists. Next slide. So now it's my pleasure to invite Jill von Rothschild to introduce Remembering Early American History with Alexandra Chan, Mark Ross, and Dr. Tiffany Mormon. This panel discussion will explore methodologies to trace, identify, and acknowledge the presence of African Americans in historical sites. Dr. Jill von Rothschild is a Luce Curatorial Fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where she is working on the museum's reinstallation of its permanent collection galleries. She is the author of the exhibition's catalog essay, Joshua Johnson, Black Artisanship and Artistry in Early National Baltimore, which examines how the painter's apprenticeship to the Baltimore blacksmith, William Forpoe, informed his artistic practice. And please join me in welcoming Jill and our presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathilde. Thank you for helping organize this today, and to Richard. And please, Richard, if anything's going wrong technically during this, just unmute and let me know. And thank you to the curators, Al Watson and Sade and Emily for their incredible exhibition, which I finally got to see last weekend, and it was such a pleasure. Let me get my screen set up here. Okay. Welcome everyone to the second panel of this symposium, Remembering Early American History. The Unnamed Figures exhibition at AFAM comes at a moment when curators, educators, and audiences of early American art are ardently looking for ways to locate African American histories in the gallery and to reframe objects in public collections to better illuminate the Black lives, labor, and skill present within them. The curators of Unnamed Figures make an important argument against this backdrop through the artworks they have assembled in their exhibition. And I felt like the two artworks used as the title slide for today's program were instructive here. The representation and creative output of African-descended peoples in early America can often be found in the objects art history and art museums typically overlook, pictures by self-taught artists, and the folk or craft object. These categories of cultural production have not historically been collected by fine art museums, and even today, many such examples of so-called outsider art or craft are not valued as equal to academic paintings and sculptures of stone or bronze. And I'm cheating a bit here using a work by Duncanson, certainly someone accepted as an academic painter for the bulk of his work as an example here, because he was trained as a decorative artist, and Sam has some of his earliest paintings that sort of show that transition from house painter to fine art painter. Objects likely made by African-descended artists further struggle to gain attention when the names of their makers have been lost, only earning a place among signed portraits and landscapes by Americans of European descent when they are by a known hand. I am lucky to have been working with the collections of the Smithsonian American Art Museum for the last 2 years, a museum that has long valued such categories of making. But even in such a collection, the utilitarian object, or even the material fragment, still typically lies outside the scope of the museum's holdings, which, like all art museums, values the singular, the exceptional, the signed, and the representational object. In my essay for the catalog, I grappled with some of these concerns in relation to the work of Joshua Johnson, who you see in the background here of our galleries. Johnson was a sought-after portrait painter in turn of the 19th century Baltimore, where he received commissions from the city's growing white merchant class. Johnson was of mixed race ancestry, born to a free white father and a now unknown enslaved Black woman. Because of his mother's status, Johnson was born into slavery, gaining his freedom through a blacksmithing apprenticeship arranged by his father when he was 19 years old. Many mysteries remain about Johnson's life and career, including how he became a portrait painter. Scholars have long speculated about how he was trained, comparing his work to his white contemporaries who may have taught him. As a result, his work is typically placed in a subpar position to theirs, one of mentee, student, or less trained. To press against this issue of Johnson's scholarship, I chose to explore an earlier phase of the artist's professional development, his work as a blacksmith, to consider how this period of craftsmanship may have impacted his later work as a painter, and to put his output as a maker into dialogue with a profession held by many Black craftsmen across the country. And no examples of metalwork attributable to Johnson's hand survive, so I had to come up with different ways to think about how this early part of his career might have impacted his portraiture. So I'm showing an image of the material object of his portraiture, the side of the stretcher of one of his portraits of the Coker brothers, where you can see the metal nails attaching the canvas to its support. And then on the left here, a portrait of young Adelia Ellender of Baltimore, which he may have done on a kind of barter commission with another craftsman, a plasterer in the city. Exploring late 18th century metalwork enabled me to examine a large and very understudied category of objects, typically excluded from art historical analysis because of their anonymity or quotidian nature. It was a now well-known painter, Joshua Johnson, whose connection to the trade provided the spark for such an inquiry. Turning to the less traditional and many times unsigned craft or decorative object, and material culture more broadly, offers the opportunity to celebrate and study the many products of Black makers in early American art. And bringing those objects into the early American gallery or classroom can unravel many assumptions of skill, influence, and range of creativity to which our field still holds. Today's speakers, Alexandra Chan, Mark Howard Ross, and Tiffany Moman, will take us out of the art museum to historic sites, archaeological digs, and digital archives to emphasize the benefits of looking at the broad material record when searching for African-American presence in early American art and history. They will take us to artifacts of that presence and share their experiences and methodologies of how to find and study Black lives and creativity at the historic site or in the archive. Their research projects remind me of the imperative to look beyond the methods of art history, and indeed the traditional art object, to locate and reframe Black presence in the early American art gallery. You can find bios of today's panelists online, so I'll simply introduce them briefly before each of their talks. Our first speaker is Dr. Alexandra Chan, an archaeologist on the Academic Advisory Board of the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford, Massachusetts, and author of Slavery in the Age of Reason, Archaeology at a New England Farm. Please welcome Dr. Chan.
Hello, everyone. I guess that cues me to share my screen. Let me get things set up here. All right. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have today. My part of the presentation is to introduce you to the Isaac Royal House and Slave Quarters Museum located in Medford, Massachusetts, and a little bit to the system of enslavement that existed in the colonial and indeed post-colonial North. I chose this image by Brian Stouffer from the Boston Globe for the fact that it is so evocative, and such an emotional way of capturing our collective ignorance and collective forgetting of the fact that there was slavery in the colonial and post-colonial North. And really forcing us to re-examine our old stereotypical and romanticized visions of riding in sleighs, sleigh bells ring, are you listening, that kind of thing. Anyway, my hope is that an overview of archaeological approaches to Black identities, life, and labor as represented at this site will invite attendees to broaden their understanding of what constitutes artistic labor of the enslaved, to include the act of surviving enslavement with a sense of personhood, both individual and collective, still intact. Isaac Royal Sr. was a merchant, but the family was involved in all three of the principal elements of the triangular trade. That means sugar, rum, and slaves. What you see here is Isaac Jr., the son, and his wife, Elizabeth, their two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who lived in the house. Also, an evocative depiction of two of the children named Joseph and Prine, who were enslaved in the house. This has been depicted by a local artisan and woodworker who made a silhouette for display in the museum, meant to present a powerful counterpoint to the opulence of the rest of the museum. And it's a very effective way to kind of shake museum goers up when they arrive on site. But from 1703, when Isaac Sr. entered the trade with his uncle Joseph, until 1775, when his son was forced to flee New England in the wake of the Battle of Lexington. For the better part of the 18th century, the family had a sugar plantation and rum distillery in Antigua and one foot in the slave trade. They returned to New England in 1737, having fled drought, disease, and a slave conspiracy that rocked the island and, in fact, implicated two of their own. Hector, their slave driver, was convicted and burned at the stake for his alleged role in the conspiracy. Kwaku is another man who was banished from the island. And so when they came to New England in 1737, there was very much a feeling of having escaped with life and limb. And they brought 27 of their more trusted enslaved people with them, and continued to be one of the wealthiest merchant families in the colonies and one of the largest slaveholding families in the region. No surprise, though, that little is written about the lives of the people enslaved at the royal house. And too often, scholars with good intentions have also unintentionally perpetuated this kind of mute fog of anonymity by talking only categorically of Black inhabitants or enslaved people. At the royal house, we're very clear from the get-go that we wanted to bring these people out of the shadows as much as possible. And first and foremost, let's start naming names. Who were the people who were here? We've got census records, probate records, tax records. They are sporadic. They give us a snapshot in time, almost like fireflies on a summer's evening, okay? And they're separated by decades or several years at a time. So we know that this is by no means a full list of the people who were enslaved here, but here are 63 men, women, and children who were enslaved by the royals between 1737 and 1775. And we were able to go on and start figuring out family groups, as well as potential kinship patterns that might have been more of African derivation than European, which was very interesting line of research. We dove deeply into naming practices and kinship patterns on the estate, which I think is arguably a very important arena for reasserting personhood in a dehumanizing, what's more personal than your name. Also, I was concerned especially with telling stories based on even the scant details of their lives that could be gleaned. So having presented the data, for example, in my book, Slavery in the Age of Reason, I also wove fictional vignettes that were made to kind of make sense of the data, because the point was not just to create knowledge, but also understanding in the reader, to tap that emotional imaginative understanding that will make people care going forward. What family groupings could be defined show that it was only a woman and her children that were considered to be family, according to white definitions. All of the men on the estate universally were recorded as single individuals with no family ties given. That said, there were 4 little boys here, name of Kwaku, Robin, Joseph, and George, who shared names with adult men on the estate at the same time, hinting at the possibility of enslaved people defining their relationships and preserving families in their own way, even as slavery sought to, tear those families asunder. Because while fathers, by white definitions, were more or less dispensable and easily sold off, the names, naming your children after their fathers or their uncles was one way to reassert the importance of that male role model in the enslaved family. Most of what we know about these people, though, comes from the archaeological record. And a fundamental question at the Royal House was where and how to find early African Americans there. The house was inhabited for 300 years, but the royals and the people they enslaved were only there for 38 of them, which translates to 2 or 3 inches really in terms of soil layers. And the question was, how would we know we were in the right place, temporally speaking? And at my proposal defense, we did go over a list of artifact types and traits that have been linked to enslaved inhabitants on sites across the South and the Caribbean. Among them, you'll see here, glass trade beads, especially blue ones, which could have been used and were used by the enslaved in the islands as currency. Small game animals that were outside the normal realm or repertoire of European tastes, like muskrat and turtle, that sort of thing. Colonial-ware pottery, which is this middle picture, is a low-fired, hand-built kind of pinch pot kind of pottery that often has markings on the surface reminiscent of African cosmograms. The possibility of musical instruments like the jaw harp or spirit caches that might hint at folk and religious practices like hoodoo, voodoo, Santeria, and the like. Archaeology used to be preoccupied with identifying these so-called Africanisms in the material record, but the problem is that Africanisms are static. They are a fixed list of traits, while identities, I think we all kind of instinctively understand, identities are relational. They're contested, they're fluid, evolving. And what's more, the purpose of Africanisms has historically been to simply establish presence or absence on a site, which I don't mind telling you is kind of a dead-end line of questioning. First of all, on historic sites like this, we usually have documents to tell us whether they were there or not. More troubling, though, is this silent addendum to the idea of an Africanism, which is that if no Africanisms are found, it is assumed that there are no Africans there, that they are completely culturally assimilated, or that there's nothing of any substance that can be said about their experience under slavery on that site. And there's really no reason at all to believe that any of that is true. Pardon me. The remedy to this lies in identifying patterns of use, curation, and discard. So patterns concern themselves with process, and they allow us to tackle much meatier questions, not were they here or weren't they, but things like where are the places that personhood could be reasserted? Where might the power dynamics of slavery have been contested? Not all resistance came down to conspiracy to revolt and striking a mighty blow for freedom. There's the everyday resistance of just, living your life. That also needs to be taken into account. So a central characteristic of pattern is that it often only begins in emergence, begins to emerge in counterpoint to another pattern. So I'd like our listeners to start trying to think of the dynamic relationship between enslaver and enslaved rather than simply fixed identities of 2 different groups. emerging notions of whiteness and blackness that we might recognize today as modern Americans likely have their roots here in the 18th century and in interactions like the ones we observed at the Royal House. We see the emergence of the American color line on sites like this. That's why it's exciting, and that's much more interesting than whether Africans were there or not. So try to think of the material world here, see on the left, you'll see, as a conversation without words that's happening in the material between the royals and those they enslaved. Statement, response, counter-response. And because it's happening in the material, it allows us to effectively eavesdrop on a conversation that was going on 250 years ago. Let's look for a moment at the royal side of that conversation to establish a base pattern. At the Royal House, the patterns most easily observed are of the landed aristocrat and the benevolent patriarch. In the absence of a landed aristocracy, a colonial society elevated the merchant class to that role. Isaac Sr. was lowborn. He was the son of a carpenter. But in the fluid structure, social structure of the 18th century, was able to make a perfect ascent to power, in part, I argue, through his adept manipulation of the material world around him. We see this in, for example, the formal gardens and landscapes that he had designed. These are revealed through remote sensing techniques. None of this is visible from the surface of the land there, but you can see the garden beds and the walkways very clearly underneath the surface there on the left, and on the right, how it was reconstructed. This was a statement of power. These pleasure gardens were a statement of power. They were a statement of cultural legitimacy. They were meant to intimidate and impress. We also see it in archaeological finds that are reflective of opulent wealth, not just in purchasing power, but in the activities and behaviors reflected, okay? We have on the left here a very early adoption of the English tea ceremony, the Young Cheng Dynasty teacups from the 1720s and 30s. This was way before the Boston Tea Party, long before most people in America even knew what tea was. Same goes for coffee and chocolate that they were consuming very early in the century. He was able to establish himself in this way as a tastemaker and a trendsetter. He set a very lavish table. Once again, an early adoption of table forks, not to be taken for granted. We take them for granted today, but at this time in the 1730s, not many Americans knew what to do with a table fork. So the fact that he had them was a novelty. It was meant to impress. We have air-twisted stemware here and plates that the Queen of England herself would have used. Also, to present his home as a center of elegant hospitality, we have abundant evidence of exotic beverages from all over the world: tea from China, punch from India, chocolate from the Americas, coffee from Africa, port from Europe. We even have right in the center of the collection of wine bottles. I don't know if you can see, but this is a wine. The tall, skinny one is a French wine bottle, which at the time that it dates to, of the French and Indian War, was totally illegal. And yet they were serving French wine at their parties. So that's the kind of stuff that we were finding. He also created an illusion of depth and longevity to his high status that wasn't real. Remember that he's only one generation removed from the trades, but in the design elements of his house, the coined corners that look like columns, the pedimented windows, they harken back to the villas of ancient Rome. Landscape design elements also harken back to antiquity. And this is a phenomenon that I came up with like a tongue-in-cheek phrase to kind of capture it, which is guilt by association. By associating himself with this elevated and ancient status, he is trying to claim those things for him, that his status is also elevated and ancient, although it is not. It's new. Notice also the way the slave quarters, which is the small building in the background, is so in such close proximity to the Great House and is built in to architecturally complement the Great House. This is a way of presenting a sanitized face of the system of enslavement that operated there. This ties into the pattern of the benevolent patriarch. He never spoke of slaves in his letters, for example. He only spoke of my people. And when he received his illustrious guests in this fabulous cobbled courtyard, it would have been at that time, what they were presented with was a very pretty as a picture scene, neat as a pin. The place where people were enslaved seemed to be getting drawn in to the center of the state under the protective wing of a benevolent patriarch. Okay, we recovered. So that's sort of the overall pattern that we get from the royal side of the equation. We recovered over 65,000 artifacts from this site. This is before the days of municipal garbage collection. And even so, this was a tremendous haul. And we've seen a bit of what the artifacts were. But when we mapped their distribution, a different pattern began to emerge that was in counterpoint to the public statements of power and beneficence that the royals were trying to make. 75% of those artifacts, for example, recovered came from the slave quarters west and south yards, the dark areas on the screen in front of you. And if we look at a photograph of that area, again, over 50,000 artifacts from these two areas, you will see it is the only place invisible from the Great House. And this is where they were throwing out the trash. So while architecture and landscape, if we go back, seem to draw the world of the enslaved inward, as I said, under the protective wing of a benevolent patriarch, artifact distribution is telling a different story about how there's a stark spatial divide in the use of space and the ways that these people were being segregated out. So this gives us essentially a look under the hood, if you will, to see a more subtle and inadvertent pattern and get an insider's view of what the royals' perceived difference was between clean and unclean, master and slave, and ultimately white and black. It's also, however, where we found all of the artifacts to do with work, play, and the daily lives of the enslaved, which suggests that this space, from an enslaved perspective, might have been blessedly free from constant surveillance. So this is what I mean when I refer to contested spaces of slavery. This area sort of represents a crack in the facade of total domination and control and power. So let's talk about that work and play among the enslaved. We have evocative evidence of games and leisure time activities, also self-adornment in the archaeological record here. Reworked potsherds into gaming pieces, some marbles. The red one is probably handmade and fired. That's interesting. We've got on the bottom a bead, clearly of non-European aesthetic. It either hand-drilled stone or it could be glass, and might be an example of one of those glass trade beads I showed you earlier. And then on the right, we've got some sewing equipment along with what appears to be a bone button, also not of a European aesthetic. These kinds of things reveal an active reassertion of humanity among the enslaved, and individuality also, personal, garments of gladness, as they used to call them. It's everyday resistance, it's creative, and it's serious business. And the reason we know this is because we find, no matter where you go in the Americas, when you start excavating sites where Africans were held enslaved, you start to find tons of evidence for games, leisure time activities, and self-adornment. And that just goes to show how important those things were in such a system of such a dehumanizing system. We found 37 clay tobacco pipes, one in the center, also possibly hand-built of local red clay. Another with, this is a commercially produced white clay pipe, but it's been altered with the incision of the letter M in several places, which we hypothesize is an initial meant to mark ownership. And what's really fascinating about this is that in 300 years of occupation on this site, there was only one person who ever lived there with a name that started with the letter M, and it was an enslaved woman named Myra in the Massachusetts slave census of 1754. So smoking was an important part of social life in the quarter. It was enjoyed by both men and women. I think that this artifact in particular shows aspirations of ownership, aspirations at least of literacy, if not actual literacy, and unique expression of self and personhood. We also have a few artifacts suggesting African-based understandings of magic, religion, and medicine. These are the closest we came to something like those so-called Africanisms, but we chose not to treat them simply as that, but rather as more of an opportunity for deeper understanding of that dynamic relationship between enslaver and enslaved. On the left is a possible charm that was found in the slave quarters west yard. It consists of a stone flake, crudely made to look like an arrowhead. You see the side notches there, and there's a little groove that's scratched between them, perhaps to better secure the object from a piece of yarn or leather thong. Based on what we know of the naming practices on this estate, the fact that many of the enslaved there had Akan day names, for example, Kwaku, which is the name of a boy born on a Wednesday, Kofi, a boy born on a Friday, Yaba, a girl born on a Thursday, that kind of thing. I developed a theory that the object may have belonged to a belief system of Akan derivation, in which prehistoric stone projectile points, which were known as Nyame Akuma, or God's axes, were believed to have magical powers. And they would find these prehistoric artifacts and assume not that they were prehistoric artifacts, but assume that they were the result of lightning striking the earth. And so they would collect them and thought they had magical powers. So this might belong to a tradition derived from that. We also recovered this on the right Native American stone tool. This is a pecked and a braided stone pestle that appears to stem from the Archaic period, which is as much as 10,000 years old. Could be as little as 2,700 years old. But coming as it does from a closed 18th century context, on a site where enslaved people lived, it also fits very well within the historically and archaeologically established phenomenon of enslaved people curating found Native American lithics for religious and ritual purposes. So for example, as an unusual object with a powerful indwelling spirit, this pestle might have been used to grind and mash the ingredients of magic ritual or medicinal concoctions. So on the one hand, these artifacts as quote unquote Africanisms, they do one thing. They immediately undermine the old popular idea that the enslaved in New England were just black Yankees, sort of throw a tri-corner hat on them and call it a day. The idea that they were more completely assimilated into Anglo-American culture, work, and family life, sometimes with the explicit addendum that Northern slavery just wasn't that bad, wasn't as bad as in other places in the Americas. And that's not at all the conclusion that we came to at the Royal House, and it's not a conclusion I encourage anyone else to come to either. The question immediately arose: to what use is magic and conjuration to harness the protective powers of a higher power on a site where the master is said to have been kind? What is a kind master? And let's push even further still. Can a master of other men and women be kind? This led to research about what the sources of instability and perceived endangerment could have been at the estate. We have no records of physical punishment at the Royal House, but there were lots of records for every other kind of thing. For example, sales galore. There are the inevitable estate divisions. When people died, enslaved people were distributed among heirs, and that separated people. And what I call a medically hostile atmosphere of the 18th century medicine, what was considered cutting edge for Western medicine at that time, the old heroic treatments of bleeding, purging, puking, force feeding of mercury, antimony, and arsenic, basically doctoring patients to further sickness and death, are demonstrably used on the royal estate, because we have their account book where they pay for these services. But it's also in complete counterpoint to African understandings of illness, which had a spiritual component as much as, if not more than, a physical one. So self-help in this case, with these magic and conjuration, artifacts of magic and conjuration. Also, we found some teacups that had heavy use wear in the bottom that we hypothesized might have been used to make tinctures, ointments, that kind of thing. Self-help in the medically hostile world of the 18th century was the only rational thing to do. We also had runaway slave advertisements. There was the tragic story of the suicide of George, who served the family for 50 years and slit his own throat upon learning about his imminent sale. Of course, there are also Hector and Quaco from the beginning of the talk, who were implicated in the Antiguan conspiracy to revolt. So within this context, it really causes people to come up short and really question where they got the idea that Northern slavery just wasn't that bad. It was different. It was different. The demographics were different. The economy was different, but it wasn't better or less bad. So within this context, then, I think these Africanisms as such are less. The other thing I have a problem with the idea of Africanisms is that it's this idea of almost like a free self-expression of ethnicity. And I really don't think that that's the right way to interpret those things in this context. It's less free expression of ethnicity than it is the logical response to the dangers of a life under slavery. So in either case, we can elaborate on that later if you care to. But in either case, the patterns of total power and benevolent patriarchy at the Royal House are undermined by patterns of self-assertion and expression, as well as patterns suggesting physical, emotional, and spiritual violence that needed to be contended with, and would have been true of slavery no matter where it existed and no matter what kind of person your enslaver was. This has been a very brief overview of some of the lines of questioning that we pursued at the Royal House. If any of it has grabbed your attention and you want to know more, I assure you it is richly detailed and filled in the book, and it also comes with stories to kind of make these people more alive and real in the light of day. The top takeaways, though, that I would say is that to understand that the material world is not a collection of inanimate objects. They're not silent. They speak to you if you know how to listen. Identities also cannot be defined so much as negotiated. So by searching for patterns in the record, we come to a more realistic understanding of this dynamic between enslaver and enslaved and the fluid ways that identities were forged, negotiated, renegotiated again and again in this violent and shifting world before the American Revolution. The metaphor of a conversation without words is great. It can be applied to almost every aspect of the material world. And here at the Royal House, you'll remember we had patterns of benevolent patriarch that was met with patterns in the ground of segregation of white from black. We had patterns of the kind master versus evidence of magic, conjuration, and self-help. We had patterns of landscape of power and ownership versus assertions of personhood that we found in recreation, naming practices, the use of space on the estate. So finally, I would just say, I hope what we were able to achieve at the Royal House was to humanize the people that were enslaved there, tell stories, name names, break the anonymity to bring them into the light of day. And I think that we've achieved that really well at the Isaac Royal House. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for that fascinating overview of your work. Excited to talk more in the Q&A about it. Please welcome our next speaker, Dr. Mark Howard Ross, William Rand Keenan Jr., Emeritus Professor of Political and author of Slavery in the North, Forgetting History and Recovering Memory. Please welcome Dr. Ross.
I want to thank you, Alexandra. I visited the Royal House, and I encourage anybody who's in Boston to take a short trip out to Medford to visit it. It's a tour that's worth taking. It's the only living available slave quarters that's existing in the North, and they really have a story to tell. And I think it's worth seeing by anybody who's interested in this subject. I'm going to talk about remembering slavery in the President's House in Philadelphia. This is the building that George Washington lived in his 8 years as president, actually 6 years because he lived in New York for 2 years. And it's a block from Independence Hall, which you can see on the left. And the Liberty Bell is now housed in the building right behind this site. And it's an incredible contrast between slavery and freedom that are 2 stories told on the site of the president's house. Next slide. What I want to do is talk about the way in which the discovery or rediscovery of this house that Washington lived in, a building that was torn down in 1835, and people don't know a lot about it. But there was an article that appeared in a somewhat obscure historical magazine in Pennsylvania that described the house in about 80 or 90 pages. And 2 paragraphs mention that while Washington was living in the house, he kept 8, and then it turns out later, 9 enslaved people there. Nobody knew it, maybe because we never asked about it. But this produced an intense reaction from various citizen groups in the city. And there was a mobilization very quickly to demand recognition of past enslavement on the site. The central role was about identity issues and inclusion and exclusion in the past and present. And I should say, many people didn't even know that there was enslavement in Pennsylvania. I kept telling people, well, we have this story, et cetera. And they say, that's not possible. It was a Quaker state, a colony and then state. And I'd say, yeah, but Quakers were slaveholders in large numbers until the eve of the American Revolution. So there was a demand to get the story right and to tell the story on the site. But not everyone agrees what the story was. And the problem for the Independence National Historical Park, which is a very big historical park in the city, was how to address slavery. And part of the reason is the historical park was created during the Cold War to tell the story of freedom and liberty. And the story of freedom and liberty is obviously at odds with the story of enslavement. So they never touched on the subject. All 13 colonies in the early United States had enslaved people in them. And the stories seem to have been forgotten. Why did the story of Northern slavery disappear? Next slide. So there was a lot of contestation and very intense feelings that people in the city had. It included politicians and included neighborhood groups. And the question was, what would be the focus of a memorial if a memorial was built? Was it going to be about Washington and the first president's house, or was it going to be about slavery, or how would the two be combined? Who would make these decisions? Would an archaeological dig be conducted because people felt there may have been a lot below the grounds that was worth finding? Who would propose and select the design for a memorial? Who would be hired to build a memorial? Who would design its contents? Where would the funds come from to pay for the project? Each step produced intense contestation and high public interest. Next slide. Northern slavery, I just want to say something quickly about it, although Alexandra touched on it. It existed in all the colonies and states, lasting 239 years and dates back to 1666 in Lower Manhattan. Massachusetts legalized slavery in 1639, although there were an incredible number of enslaved people in that colony and then later state. It certainly was practiced there. There are frequent sales and renting out, which is something Alexandra hinted at. So life was very unstable, and it was very hard to establish families for enslaved people. Many enslaved people lived in cities and were craftswomen too, but more women worked only in the homes. Others worked in the ports and in construction. There were revolts, protests, and many escape attempts, most of which were not successful in the North. Next slide. Gradual manumission in the North was very gradual. Many northern states passed gradual abolition laws. Pennsylvania did it in 1780. I'll summarize it very quickly. What happened was that it said that any enslaved person who gave birth to a child would be free after 1780. However, if they were a female, they would have to wait till they were 21, and if they were a male, 28, and then later 25, to pay back, quote unquote, the owners for having raised them. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island all passed similar laws. The issue of compensation for slave owners was a sticking point in many cases. And lastly, you should know that New Jersey was the last state to end slavery, which only ended because of the 13th Amendment that the New Jersey legislature did not even ratify in 1865. Next slide. Most northern slaveholders only owned one or two people, and slavery was much more urban than it was in the South. The enslaved mainly lived in attics, back rooms, and kitchens, not in separate buildings. So that what you saw in Medford is exceptional because it's the only existing slave quarters that we still have in the North. The enslaved often ate meals with other household members who often worked in the fields with them in rural areas. In rural areas, there were often very few other Black people nearby, and it was hard to develop friends and families. Next slide. Memory recovery. How did this occur? Why did it occur? There are a lot of different answers. One is the civil rights movement and bills led to increased Black empowerment, rights, growing middle class, media visibility, and changing attitudes, people asking about the past. Increased Black voice and representation in public life, in the media, and in politics. More Blacks in universities studying about African-American life in the present and past really mattered, including slavery and increased interest in the disciplines and African-American experiences. The change in focus in the history as a discipline, moving towards social history and not just the study leaders and the countries and what they were doing. Finally, there was a rise in public interest in history and genealogy after the airing of Roots, which was viewed by an incredible number of people, and then the Civil War shows. Next slide. In the North, there's no single path to memory recovery. It's a kind of snowball process. Once research begins on any questions that people found out about, the assumption that there were no available records turned out to be wrong. There's so much more material than people had expected. For example, in almost all New England towns, the public records go back into the 1600s and 1700s. Next slide. Collected memory storage involves shared narratives about past events and people, and what's included and what's omitted is important to ask. Shared rituals and enactments, holidays, festivals, parades, ceremonies, music, language are all places where these are shared and stored. Symbolic landscapes, sacred sites like museums, monuments, memorials, tell stories in different ways, but keep the stories alive. And these provide and sustain emotional connections to people and events across time and place. Next slide. I want to talk about the symbolic landscape. Symbolic landscape is what people can see and what people can walk on and what people can touch. It's incredibly important in memory creation and memory storage. Next slide. So I want to show you the public landscape in different places in the North, just as for some examples. This is a historical marker. It's across the street from the Delaware River, where boats came from Africa and from the West Indies with enslaved people who were sold on this site. Next slide. This is a house in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, that was less than a half a mile, probably a quarter mile from where my office was for 46 years. It was a plantation in the early 1700s, the 18th century, that grew all kinds of things. And it was dozens and dozens and really hundreds of acres. And the Harrington family was a very important, Harrison family was very important. You can visit this now and learn some of these stories, but they didn't tell the story of enslavement there for a long, long time. Next slide. This is the Lot House in Brooklyn, New York, which is similar. Recent research has found a number of objects that were owned by enslaved people who were living in the attic there. This house dates from the 1600s also. By the way, Brooklyn had in the 18th century, early 18th century, 65 to 70% of its population were enslaved Black people. Next slide. This is Sylvester Manor. I'm sorry about the siren outside. I didn't call them. Sylvester Manor is in Shelter Island, New York. This was part of a plantation that, like many plantations in Long Island, in Connecticut, and in Rhode Island, grew a lot of food crops and grazed animals. These were taken and sold in the islands so that the islanders could grow sugarcane and not waste, quote unquote, their land on food. Next slide. Smith's Castle in North Kingston, Rhode Island. Another home in which in the 17th and 18th century enslaved people lived. Next slide. This is a house called Cliveden that's now a historical site that was built by a man who was the first Supreme Court justice in Pennsylvania, and he was the largest Pennsylvania enslaver. He also, and then the rest of the family through generations, owned properties with a lot of enslaved workers in Delaware. And they would sometimes be brought to the house here and worked here, and sometimes they go back to Delaware. Next slide. This is a memorial to the enslaved people who were important in building Harvard Law School. Harvard Law School was initially endowed by the royal family who lived only about a mile away. Next slide. This is a famous site, the African Burial Ground National Monument in New York, in Lower Manhattan. If you get there, it's really worth seeing. There was a long conflict about the site, which nobody knew about the burial ground. And when the federal government wanted to build a building on the site, in 1990, they had to do an archaeological dig. And they thought it was just a waste of time because this is Lower Manhattan, a block off Wall Street. They must have nothing that is new. But what the problem was that Lower Manhattan, in that part of New York, was much hillier than it is now, because it was filled in subsequently. The African population, the enslaved African population in New York, could not bury anybody who died within the city walls. So there's a little bit north of Wall Street. They were given a ground that is this ground, and it turned out it was so hilly that when they started to do the excavation, they found burials that were as deep as 25 feet because all the land had been filled in. So they began to excavate, and they decided there were 15 to 20,000 people who had been buried there. And after they had 400 or so, there was pressure from the Black community to stop digging these people up and do something to memorialize the site. Next slide. It took a long time before they put up this monument, or this is part of a larger monument, and they reinterred the people who had been dug up, the 400 or so people, after a forensic anthropologist in Washington, D.C. had done a lot of work on the remains, and we learned a lot about how these people worked so hard and were not in very good shape. Next slide. It's a beautiful memorial, and you can walk around. There's a lot of description, and it's well worth seeing in Lower Manhattan. Next slide. Inside, there's a small museum, and among other things, they have images like this of some of the 419 people who were disinterred and then reburied on the site. Next slide. This is Philadelphia. This is downtown Philadelphia in 1950. The red outline shows where the president's house was when it had existed until 1835. And these buildings that you see were all torn down to make way for Independence Hall National Park. Next slide. This is what one person conjectured was what the house looked like. But they knew some things and not others. And so this is not a perfect picture, but it's the only one that's available. Next slide. This is the site today. And you can see that whole block was cleared out along with a number of other blocks. Independence Hall National Park is Independence National Historical Park. Sorry, I always mix up the name. Is really quite. Someone wants me to mention Michael Blakey, who did lead the African burial ground research. Thank you. He's a very interesting academic. Next slide. I'm interested in particularly what I call the symbolic landscape, pictures of places where you either have artifacts or you can imagine what the artifacts were about. So one of the things that was decided when they decided to build a memorial here for the president's house was there was an archaeological dig. Next slide. One of the smart things they did is they built a platform where visitors could stand, look down at what was being dug, but there was always an archaeologist who was there who could, and they took turns, who would talk to people and tell them what was being done and what had been done. In less than 4 months, there were over 300,000 people who came and viewed this site, and it was a very moving occasion for many, many people in Philadelphia. One of the stories I like is there was a man who was a great photographer in the city, an older Black man, and he was asked by the chief of staff of the city council or the mayor to go to the site and take pictures. And he got angry. He said, "I don't take pictures of holes in the ground. I take pictures of buildings and people who are meaningful." And she said, "Please go." So he came a number of days. And one day, he said he burst into tears because on the left side of this look that you have here is uncovering a set of walls that led from the back of the house where the food was cooked to the front where the Washingtons and whoever they had for dinners would be served. And he said, "I started crying and I couldn't stop. I imagined one of my ancestors was walking on that path." I'll never forget that. Next slide. After the dig was done, they decided not to cover it all up. They were going to cover everything up. And they have this vitrine where you could look down. And next slide. One of the things that it shows are where some of the foundations were, but this curved stone here is assumed to be from the dining room in the home that Washington decided to try to get a bow window put in, and it was the basis for the one that was put into the actual White House. Next slide. The site is filled with these panels, historical panels, that are not telling a sanitized view of what slavery was about here. And it was very striking to a number of people because people, and in some ways, always expect euphemisms, and this site does not have a lot of euphemisms. Next slide. Here's another one of the panels. You can't read the text, so you have to go there for yourself if you want to see it. Next slide. On the back, on the left is a memorial, and I'll get a closer view of the memorial. And then the doors that you see lead you into the building where you can see the Liberty Bell. And one of the people I knew well who was the head of a group called Avenging the Ancestors Coalition that organized to try to get a memorial built. He says, to get in to see the wonders of freedom, you have to go through the hell of slavery. And that's really quite interesting because it sums up much of the early American experience. Next slide. Here's a tribute to the African groups that the enslaved people in Philadelphia and in North America came from. The country names, but also the tribal names. Next slide. This is on the day of the inauguration in 2010 of this memorial. The man speaking is still the head of Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, and it's the name of the 9 enslaved people that came to Philadelphia and worked for Washington. One of the interesting side stories is Philadelphia had passed a law, Pennsylvania had passed a law, that a non-Philadelphia resident could bring an enslaved person with him or her for up to 30 days. And if they kept them more than 6 months, they would become free. What did Washington do? Because he was president there for 6 years. He saw that they went back and forth to Mount Vernon, and sometimes Martha Washington would simply take a ferry ride over to New Jersey, which was easy, and then back. And so that counted as leaving and then coming back. So they had another 6 months. Next slide. Two of Washington's enslaved people successfully ran away. This is Ona Judge, who was told by Martha Washington that she was going to be a gift for Martha's daughter's wedding, and she was not very keen on that. And she escaped one night and got on a boat and went to New Hampshire, where Washington tried to chase her, but he was never successful in bringing her back. And there's a long book that's a good story about her life. Next slide. The other person who escaped was Hercules, who was Washington's cook. And towards the end of Washington's presidency, his son came up and worked also for Washington. And Washington was not very happy and was concerned with what they might be plotting. So they were sent back to Mount Vernon. And on Washington's birthday in 1796, Hercules ran away. He made it to New York. There were some sightings of him in New York, but we don't know much of anything about how he lived there, but he never was caught. Next picture. This is a picture of Washington's family with Billy Lee, who was Washington's long-term personal man. And he is one of the few people who's set free on the day that Washington dies. But he also should say Washington freed all his enslaved people in his will, but they would not be free till Martha Washington also freed hers, because she had a number of enslaved people, more than Washington did, from her first husband, who they lived in the islands. So next slide. Here's another panel that's on the site. I should have put it with the others, but I'm sorry. Next slide. I'm sorry, this is just a repeat. Next slide. I don't know what happened here. Next slide. No, next slide. No. Okay, stop. The members of Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, which is the group I worked with the most. Often I was the only white person in their meetings. They were very friendly and very helpful. And they began to celebrate Hercules Freedom Day on Washington's birthday every year, and they still do it. And they also have a July 4th celebration. Next slide. One of the really interesting things is a woman who was a lawyer in the city government was very engaged in setting up the legal side of the building of the President's House site. And she's a quilter. And when the house was done, she wrote to quilter groups throughout the country and asked them to make quilts based on any part of the stories. And they got 50 really incredible quilts that were shown in museums on the site in the Constitution Center a block away in the African American Museum and in the Visitor Center. And I'll just show you several of them. They're really interesting. Next slide. My time's up, so we'll just show these very quickly. This is one. Notice George and Martha at the table. Okay, next one. Next slide. The Tree of Liberty. I used this picture for the cover of my book. Next slide. And freedom is light, for which many have died in darkness. That's George and Martha, and the enslaved people on the left. Next slide. This might be the last one. Oh no, last thing. One of the spin-offs from this was a real interest in burying grounds. And this is a memorial from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I can tell a lot of interesting stories about it, but they had enslaved people from the 1640s in Portsmouth. Next slide. And this is God's Little Acre in Newport, Rhode Island, which is a colonial era burying ground. It's one of the few burying grounds that I've seen in the North where Black people and white people are in the same grounds. There was a section for Blacks here, but it's not marked off differently. Next slide. In Philadelphia, there was a burying ground that was just south of what was the city boundary in 1810. And the Absalom Jones, who founded Mother Bethel Church, bought the grounds as a place where Black people could be buried, because there was a law that you said you could not bury a Black person in the city. And then there was an archaeological dig that a private historian, a public historian, wrote about. And one of the things he did in studying this grounds, he went to City Hall records and found the names of 2,500 people who had been buried there from the time it was opened until 1865, when it closed. And archaeologists did a small dig, and they have concluded there could be up to 10,000 people in this burying ground. Next slide. This is a ceremony that was conducted by some people in New York and Philadelphia, which was a libation to remember the enslaved people at the Bethel burying grounds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. This is such a fascinating site. I've been there myself, and it's really unlike any other kind of memorial site like this I've ever seen.
They're all worth visiting.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. And please welcome everyone, our final panelist, Dr. Tiffany Moman, Assistant Professor of History and Mellon Fellow at Sewanee, the University of the South. Dr. Moman is the founder and director and co-director of the Black Craftsmanship Digital Archive, a major research project that she will share more about today with us. Please welcome Dr. Moman.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for the invitation to join you here today. And a big thank you to everyone behind the scenes for making this presentation possible. And so I titled this talk, Someone Knows My Name, Frameworks for Researching the Lives and Experiences of Black Craftspeople, because I wanted to offer practical methods for doing the research and to encourage people to do the research. So often I hear that researching Black craftspeople is too hard, because there is not a lot of available information due to biases in the archive. And to that, I often say that just because the work is hard, that doesn't mean that we don't do the work. And we have to do the work because these are people that we are talking about here. And it's important to know how they lived and what they experienced, no matter how long ago they lived. And so I want to start today with this image. A few years ago, one of my students, Melanie Goodman, brought this source to my attention. And so today I want to acknowledge her and her research on enslaved seamstresses. So thank you, Melanie. And so this is an image of Lucindy Lawrence Jordan, or Jordan. And Miss Jordan was interviewed sometime between 1936 and 1938 as part of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Writers Project Slave Narrative Interviews. And as I proofread Melanie's paper and came across this image, I immediately thought, well, what a nice image. But then I Googled Miss Jordan and found her full interview. And as I read it, a few things stood out to me. And so the interviewer made a point of noting that at the start of the interview, that she, quote, she got out her old spinning wheel, sat down before it, and beamed. And I want to repeat that one more time. She got out her old spinning wheel, sat down before it, and beamed. And the interviewer continued asking Miss Jordan about her life, and she recalled that her mother had been a fine weaver, and that the spinning wheel that she was so proud of had once belonged to her mother and could still be used to that day. And so just who was Miss Jordan, and who was her mother? Miss Jordan left behind clues in her interview that she had been born to Emmanuel and Patsy Lawrence about 1858 in Macon, Georgia. She was interviewed between 1936 and 1938 in Opelika, Lee County, Alabama. And so using these clues, I traced her through the records. I found her on the US Census beginning in 1900 and again in 1910 and 1920. And so the 1920 US Census pictured here on screen recorded that she was living with her daughter Pearl and her grandson Griefus, both of whom she mentioned in the interview. They lived on Society Hill Road, which today is just a little country road with a smattering of small homes. The home that she is standing in front of in the photograph is of course long gone, but nevertheless, Miss Jordan lives on. I was able to locate her descendants, including a great-granddaughter still living in Opelika, Alabama. And so Miss Jordan's story stood out to me primarily because we often don't see very many photographs of Black craftspeople with the tools that they use during their work. And it also stood out to me because I had not yet gone through the WPA slave narratives in search of craftspeople. It highlighted the importance of turning to all of these sources one can find for answers. And I certainly don't have to tell anyone here today why tracing Miss Jordan is significant. I could also argue that it was very easy to find Miss Jordan because during her lifetime, records on the lives of Black people became easier to find due to the US Census finally accounting for Black lives. What I will say is that Miss Jordan's story is just one of the thousands of stories that we are working to document through the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive. And you can find our website here pictured on screen at blackcraftspeople.org. And so the BCDA is a digital humanities site dedicated to documenting the lives and experiences of Black craftspeople from this country's earliest beginnings through 1900. And so the website is currently home to records connected to the lives of 960 Black craftspeople, both men and women, adults and children, free and enslaved, involved in a total of 45 total trades, from wheelwrights and tanners to cabinet makers and goldsmiths, who lived and labored in 18th century South Carolina and the Low Country and 19th century Tennessee. And we currently have ongoing research in Louisiana, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Mississippi, Virginia, Antigua, Jamaica, and more. And I'm happy to say that we've been able to bring students along in this work to help us in building the archive. I do want to make a special note that our website is still currently under construction, and its full revamp should be done, fingers crossed, at the end of the summer. And so when we do this work, we organize it into 3 areas. We have the digital archive, and here you have the option to browse by collections organized by trade, use the search engine to find Black craftspeople by keyword, or even to contribute your own research or knowledge on Black craftspeople that we then fully attribute to you. And then our People and Places section is soon to come, where we will write short biographies of Black craftspeople in our larger digital archive. And of course, maps. I love a good map. And what I like most about the map is placing people on the landscape. I like the idea that you can then use a map to see people, to see where they were, and to also think about their lives and locations in connection to your own life and location as well. And the maps page will take you to a map where you have the ability to search the data in a variety of ways, connecting that primary source that we use, which is primarily runaway advertisements, to specific locations on the map. And so what rests at the core of this project is finding Black craftspeople and telling their stories through what we can learn about their lives, the objects they created, and the places that they impacted. And so our approach to this research is posted here on screen. And first, we begin by examining sources, and these can be anything from newspaper articles to census records to wills and estate records. And we comb through them looking for the details and names, and we record all of that information. And so we started this project primarily using advertisements seeking the return of self-emancipated people. And there was so much information in those advertisements that raised so many questions, right? So for example, those advertisements provided a wealth of information on practiced trades, physical descriptions, literacy, language, reasons why enslaved people might have self-emancipated, possible destinations, and more. And so since that time, we have incorporated advertisements selling enslaved Black craftspeople, United States Census records, and information that we find from private papers. And so next we turn to objects, and the purpose here is to take existing objects and research them to find out more about their creators and the creation of the object itself. And so when we examine objects, we step away from an art history connoisseurship approach, and we center the craftsperson. We start by asking simply who made the object, and then we move to questions such as what skill or knowledge did the creation of the object require? What were the craftsperson's experiences, and how is craft knowledge produced by Black life? And our third avenue here is place. And when I say place, I am thinking beyond just latitude and longitude points. I am really thinking here about the presence of people. I am thinking about the effect of people on place and the effect of place on people. And of course, all 3 of these avenues rest upon understanding the larger context of Black life in this country. And I can't reiterate that point any louder, because that is so, so important to the work that we do at the BCDA. And I'm often asked, well, where do you start? How do you start doing this type of research? And so I want to just give a quick review of a few of the sources that have guided us along the way. We heavily leaned on the work of Lathan Windley, who wrote several volumes of books containing advertisements seeking the return of self-emancipated people. We often rely heavily on the work of James Newton and Ronald Lewis, 2 historians who documented the presence of enslaved people in about 250 trades and handicrafts. And we often turn to the work of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, scholar and sociologist, and his documentation in the work The Negro Artisan, as well as his work that a lot of you may be familiar with out of Philadelphia. He was known for taking surveys of Black people, recording their occupations, and sort of putting that into the larger context of how we understand the work of Black workers in this country. And so I should mention that all three of those books that I just shared on screen, you can find them on archive.org and actually read them for free. And so this is an appendix from Ronald Lewis and James Newton's book. And I just wanted to share it for a moment to sort of point out some of the trades and craft work where they located enslaved and free Black craftspeople. And so you can see in this list close to 250 occupations, crafts, and trades, everything from engineers to jewelers to stone sculptors, toy makers, coffin makers, engravers, ship carpenters, limners, and more. And Newton and Lewis combined this list, created it by combing through newspapers dating back to the 18th century and doing close reads to find the presence of Black craftspeople. And so knowing on this and building on our understanding of the historical context, we then began our searches. And I always start with newspapers. I read a lot of 18th century newspapers, often just looking for the presence or mention of Black craftspeople. And so today I want to start here with Jamaica. And so the May 28th, 1784 edition of Montego Bay, Jamaica's Cornwall Chronicle newspaper included an advertisement from enslaver Alex Ainsley. Ainsley sought the return of a self-emancipated man named Bob, writing, quote, "Run away from the subscriber on Sunday night last, an American Negro named Bob, but is sometimes called Peter. He is a stout-made fellow, about 5 feet 10 inches high, 45 years of age, by trade a carpenter and sawyer, and is very remarkable, being blind of one eye. Speaks good English and may endeavor to pass as a free man, as he formerly had a manumission from His Excellency Governor Campbell, but has since been the property of William Miller of Kingston, from whom the subscriber purchased him. Whoever will secure him in any jail or workhouse or deliver him to Mr. James Johnson or the subscriber shall be liberally rewarded." Combing through the newspapers, just 2 years later, Bob makes an appearance once more in the May 18, 1786 edition of the Cornwall Chronicle, with an enslaver also seeking his return. And that advertisement noted that Bob was the property of James Johnson, but late the property of Alexander Ainsley, who was also a carpenter. It noted that Bob was by trade a carpenter, rather blind in one eye. It also listed his height, his age. It noted that he would attempt to also pass as a free man. And like most advertisements, it wrapped up by seeking his return and appealing to the public to aid in Bob's return. So looking at these advertisements, the next step here naturally was for me to go back and look at some of that historical context of what was happening in Jamaica in the late 18th century. And by combing through the newspapers, this time not necessarily looking for enslaved craftspeople, but this time looking at what was happening in Jamaica. Were they building buildings? Were they building ships? What were the local newspapers reporting? What types of actions were they reporting that were occurring in the colony? I quickly found that the projects that Bob possibly could have contributed to could have ranged from simple carpentry work to carpentry work that aided in the production of sugar. And that work would have involved the construction of windmills, to other carpentry work that assisted in the construction of furniture or buildings to aid in that sugar production. And so after I found myself looking into Jamaica's newspapers, thinking about the industries that were happening there, I immediately turned to see what scholars had written on the work of enslaved craftspeople in Jamaica. And I found a very surprising story. Historian Trevor Bernard's research into slavery in Kingston, Jamaica, revealed a recollection of enslaved carpenters written by Johann Waldeck, a German traveler who spent time in Kingston during the American Revolution. And Waldeck described the workshop environment of his friend, who was a German master carpenter who also enslaved 19 people to labor in his workshop. And Waldeck recalled that the 19 enslaved people contributed to the cabinet work by making furniture from mahogany. He also recalled that, quote, They had been trained so well that they did the most excellent cabinet work, and that their work allowed his German friend to no longer work and to amass enough money to become a real estate speculator. Waldeck's German friend might have possibly been one of the Blinchinden brothers, German cabinet makers who lived in Jamaica in the late 18th century. Historian Peter Carson's work on early cabinet makers in Jamaica revealed that the Blinchinden brothers had over 30 enslaved craftspeople laboring in their shop. Early research into the trades of Black craftspeople in 18th century Jamaica, conducted by the students who worked with the BCDA, revealed a predominance of enslaved men laboring in the woodworking trades of carpentry, coopering, ship carpentry, joinery, and sawyering. So there is still more work to be done on these very large sets of Black cabinet makers in Jamaica, but I did want to tell you how we got started in that work. And so what might this approach look like back home in South Carolina? And so I want to begin with the Pinckney family of Charleston, South Carolina. Behind the portraits pictured on screen were hundreds of enslaved people laboring to provide the Pinckneys with the best objects that slave labor could buy. And today I want to focus on Eliza Lucas Pinckney, well known as the botanist and innovator who allegedly made indigo production in South Carolina profitable. When she landed in Charleston from Antigua in 1739, she quickly found herself in charge of her family's many plantations, as seen on the map on screen. And the plantations are highlighted there in letters A through H. And as the story goes, while she managed these plantations, she also perfected indigo cultivation and produced her first successful indigo crop. But let's pause here for just a moment and focus on this letter on screen that she wrote to her son, Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, in September 1785, when he asked her to recall how she cultivated indigo. Eliza began the letter writing, quote, "My dear child, you wish me to inform you what I recollect of the introducing and culture of indigo in this country." And on the next 3 pages, she continued to describe the process. She mentioned that her father sent a man named Nicholas Cromwell from Montserrat to aid her, writing, quote, "He sent a man from the island of Montserrat by the name of Cromwell, who had been accustomed to making indigo there and gave him high wages. He made some brick vats on my father's plantation on Wapoo Creek, and there he made indigo. It was very indifferent." What Eliza failed to mention in her recollections were the enslaved men and women who aided her in the production of indigo. But thanks to the thorough research of all of the sources, including Eliza's personal letter book, papers belonging to the Pinckney family men, Pinckney will and estate records, and even her father's letters, we now know their names. Among them were enslaved man, John Quash Williams, who created wooden indigo vats for Eliza when the vats made by the previously mentioned Cromwell produced indigo that was, quote, indifferent. Williams' labor led to the production of Eliza's first successful indigo crop when he made wooden indigo vats for her. In other letters between Cromwell and the Pinckneys, Cromwell expressed frustration with having to teach enslaved individuals at the Pinckneys' plantations how to cultivate indigo. Among those present were Lucinda, Grace, Bess, Gibba, Ket, Betty, Flora, Mary, Hannah, Sarah, Memba, and others. Any or all of them could have aided in the cultivation of indigo, and now we know their names. The Pinckneys also heavily relied on enslaved women to create their textiles. In the collections of the Library of Congress is a small piece of silk pictured here on screen, made in Charleston on one of the Pinckney family's plantations. And the note accompanying this piece of silk in the archive stated, quote, "In 1755, Mrs. Pinckney, second wife of Chief Justice Pinckney and mother of Mrs. Harriet Ory, the same lady who introduced the indigo plant, took with her to England a quantity of excellent silk, which she had raised and spun near Charleston, sufficient to make 3 complete dresses." Eliza gave some of this silk created by enslaved women to the Dowager Princess Augusta of Wales during a visit to Britain. Textile historian Karen Hampton noted in her research that the Lucas and Pinckney families thoroughly understood the value of enslaved women learning to spin and weave. In 1745, Eliza's father, George Lucas, told her, quote, "I pray you will purchase wool and set them to making Negro clothing, which may be sufficient for my own people. As I'm afraid one spinner can't keep the loom at work, I pray you will order a sensible Negro woman or two to learn to spin, and spinning wheels to be made for them." Eliza wrote back to her father the next year, noting that the enslaved women had spun all of the material that they could get. Pinckney family account books, such as the one pictured here on screen, detail the amounts and types of fabrics purchased for the women that they held in bondage to craft. Of note is that calico was purchased for an enslaved woman, Sophia. For enslaved women, Sophia, Susan, and Phyllis. The Pinckneys also purchased homespun, flannel, ticking, binding, and 3 waistcoat patterns. Further pages in the account ledger revealed that the Pinckneys purchased mattress needles, 800 large needles, and dozens of buttons. What is evident through this research on Black craftspeople enslaved by the Pinckneys is that research matters, period. As we see here, enslaved people were heavily involved in cultivating indigo, spinning, weaving, sewing, and making mattresses on the Pinckney family plantations. And so the sources used here are held by the Library of Congress, the South Carolina Historical Society, and the South Caroliniana Library at the University of South Carolina. And so if we are going to tell these stories, we must go where the records are. We must layer the records to fully flesh out complete stories. If we'd taken Eliza Pinckney's words alone, we would have never discovered the names of the enslaved people whose labor and craft brought her so much acclaim. And as I've mentioned, the BCDA is all about centering Black craftspeople. When we examine objects, we ask ourselves some of the questions posted here on screen. We start out, of course, by asking who made the object, but we then continue with a series of questions to flesh out the craftsperson's life. When we examine objects, we step away from the traditional art history way of doing this work, and we think beyond connoisseurship, right? Because our goal here is to center people, to tell the stories of people, and to get as close to these people as we possibly can through our research. You can see these questions on screen, and I think one of my favorite questions here is, how is craft knowledge produced by Black life? And here I am specifically thinking of what bits of craft knowledge were passed from craftsperson to craftsperson. What might a father have taught his son, a mother taught her daughter about the work that they were doing? And I often think about how those methods of craft work that they taught and passed down continued to be passed down over generations. One of the best examples I can think of is the story of blacksmith Philip Simmons in Charleston, South Carolina, who was taught his trade by Peter Simmons, no relation, and that Simmons learned the trade from his father. And today, Philip Simmons's work is all over Charleston for us to see anytime we simply take a walk on the peninsula. So as I close here, I want to remind you of the way that we do this work. We start out by looking at the sources, we then look at objects, and we then look at place. And we understand that all of this work rests strongly and firmly on understanding the context of Black life in this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And thank you to all the panelists today. I invite everyone to come back on camera for a conversation and kind of debrief of your talks. And we've got about 15 minutes before this session ends at 1 o'clock. So I'll just kick us off with a kind of big question for everyone. And then I think Matilda will help feed us some questions coming in from the audience. So everyone on the call, please be thinking about any questions you have, and you can share them in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But as you all have been talking, I've been overwhelmed by the amount of examples you've shown today of presence of African Americans in early American sites and material culture, and many different contexts. And so I've been thinking about that in terms of the presence side of the Unnamed Figures exhibition title, Unnamed Figures, Black Presence and Absence in the Early American North. But my question is maybe a little more about the absence that you all deal with in different ways in your work. And I'm hope to invite you to speak a little bit more about how you deal with absences in your archives or in the projects that you're working on, the sites that you've talked about in your research, and just a couple of the ways that I've seen that come through in your talks. Tiffany, I was just curious about the kind of relationship between your sources and then the extant objects you have to engage. And I'm sure they rarely match up, that you don't usually have objects made by the makers that you find in the textual sources. And maybe you don't know much about the actual makers of objects that we have today in collections and things like that. And Alexandra, I was thinking about the kind of many ambiguities around the archaeological record that you must have had to grapple with, and that you find, you can tell us so much about such small fragments, but so many questions remain, you know, except for the example of Myra that you showed, you know, not many objects can probably be linked to a particular person. And so I'm a little curious about how you fill in the gaps there. And then Mark, thinking about the President's House and Slave Memorial site in Philadelphia that you talked about. I've been there, like I said, and what's really striking about that, that physical area is that you walk on top of examples of where the walls were found in the archaeological dig in the sites for the house that's no longer there, of course. And so I wonder maybe if you would want to talk a little bit about how that site overcomes absence in maybe the way it's laid out, or the biographies of the individuals living there that it tries to tell. So those are just some ideas, but feel free to talk about whatever comes to your mind. Alexandra, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Okay. And if I'm going to thinking about like the uncertainties of the archive, as you say, I feel like this is not something that I've needed to, it's not something I think needs to be dealt with so much as simply accepted and understood. And the thing about historical archaeology is that we're doing so much more than digging through. I like to tell people I spend as much time digging through archives as I do digging through dirt. And you've got these different lines of evidence, primary documents, secondary documents, the archaeological record. And these three lines of evidence are more or less kind of telling the same story, but from a different angle. And they kind of fit together like gears, you know, inside of a, you know, like a clock mechanism. And they sort of, they kind of fill in the gaps for each other in a lot of ways that is very helpful, and why historical archaeology is so appealing to me, having initially thought I wanted to do prehistoric archaeology where you really do only have what's coming up out of the ground. I love historical because you have all of these different other lines of evidence that you can bring to bear. But what's interesting though is that where these lines of evidence may fill in the gaps for each other, there's also going to be places where they contradict each other. And that, rather than something to be, you know, upset about, it really should draw your interest, your interest and attention the most, because where the documentary record is saying one thing and the archaeology seems to be saying something else, that's not troubling, that's interesting. and you want to zero in and find out, like, how can I account for these two data sets and have both of them be true in some way, you know? And so I have found that by combining the three lines of evidence, you end up coming to such a deeper, richer, more nuanced understanding of the past than any one line of evidence could have done on its own. I think that's how I would think about it. Yeah.
Tiffany, do you want to jump in?
Sure. And Alexandra's last point there about combining all of the evidence is really, really close to what we do at the BCDA, right? When we combine all of the records that we find. But when I think about the absence, so I deal primarily with the absence of information of the documentary record in the archive. And so that raises sort of those larger questions about what is actually in our archives and how our archives aren't accurate reflections of American life, how we are sort of, when you go into an archive, you're sort of fighting against the biases of past archivists who either did not collect things, or maybe they threw things away, or whatever the case may be, right? And I think for us in the work that we do, at the BCDA, I always stress the importance of making sure that people understand that we cannot connect every craftsperson we find to a specific object. And that understanding why we cannot do that is sort of critical to really being in tune with the history of Black life in this country, and understanding that so many of the people that we're looking at were considered property, who had no power to record themselves as the makers of many of the objects that they actually contributed to. And so in the work that we do, it's so important when we do find a signed object. You shared Jars by Vessels by David Drake earlier, and I'm also thinking about furniture by cabinet makers. I'm thinking of John Goff of Charleston and Thomas Gross of Philadelphia, who wrote their names on the bottom of drawers pushed back into these large chests that was never meant to be seen, right? And how that attribution is such a rare thing. And so in celebrating people like Goff and Gross, I think we can also celebrate the folks that we can't contribute a specific object to as well.
Thank you. Mark, how would you like to respond to this question?
I guess I was struck that even someone who was associated with George Washington, we don't know a tremendous amount about their lives. We learn about the person who ran off to New Hampshire because of records in New Hampshire, not much from the Washington books. But one of the things I was going to say, which is a little bit different, but it's not at odds with what people have said, is the intensity of conflict in discussions about what should be done and what can be done in building a site like this. And for example, there were some people who were really upset that the dimensions of the site differ a little bit from what the original site seemed to have been. And I'm talking about, I think, 2 or 3 feet on the front. The house was a little bit further out towards the street. And now it's a city street and a city sidewalk. And the people who designed the monument said, we got to have people walk places where people can walk in a big city like this, and 2 or 3 feet aren't going to make any difference. The same thing in terms of the width of the building. Same kind of difference, and some of the historians were throwing fits and saying, this will not be taken seriously if the dimensions are different. And other people said, hey, listen, we're telling a story about the past and about people, and that's what the primary goal is, not producing an archaeological replica of what the house was.
Thank you. Well, some questions coming in from the chat. I'll just try and combine them. Maybe Tiffany, sort of two quick questions for you. Well, maybe not so quick, but someone in the chat is asking about the nature of dressmaking as a form of craft and what it might have entailed, and if you want to speak to that. And then the Q&A, someone also asked if there were incidents of if the incidents of self-emancipation were more frequent for craftspersons as a category of the enslaved, if you've considered that in your research.
Sure. So I don't think the frequency was much different. And again, we're sort of dependent upon what enslavers are writing in these advertisements, seeking, to get enslaved folks back. I don't think that the frequency was most different, but something I have noticed in the research is that enslaved craftspeople sort of take on these larger roles in their community. People look up to them. And so when you begin to research, say, for example, uprisings amongst enslaved people, there is usually always craftspeople there on the front line, whether they are leading the uprising or sort of one of the, sort of people at the top who's bringing people together. You always see craftspeople in those roles, going back to the Stono Rebellion. I'm hoping that somebody writes that paper one day so I can read it. And I think to answer the other question about dressmakers, what I found about enslaved dressmakers is that they're doing it all from scratch. So the work that they are doing is, taking this fabric, making patterns, putting these dresses together. And these aren't often just, sometimes they're simple dresses, sometimes they're very elaborate dresses. One of the things that I've seen most frequently in Charleston in the 18th century is that when enslaved seamstresses self-emancipate, their enslavers are often writing about and leaving notes in the paper that says, you may be able to find her because she's going to be elaborately dressed, or she fashioned elaborate clothing for herself. So it's sort of using her ability to make these dresses as a way to surveil her and also hopefully get her back. So.
That's so interesting. Thank you. And thank you all. I think we're approaching 1. So I just want to be mindful of the time so we all have a break before the next panel. I hope everyone on the call found many, many things to aid in their own work from your talks. I had this question of absence in my mind because I think in the art museum, which is the context I'm coming from, is grappling with this question a lot, and the question of how to address histories that may not be there in the collection or that might be invisible in the collection. And I think all of your work across these fields and these different sites of scholarship give museum curators and educators a lot to think about. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We have so many compliments and praise in the chat for all your work and fabulous research and across media and also across fields. So thank you so much for being with us and for sharing this important work with us. And thank you, Jill, for hosting today this first panel of the day. It was an incredible start to the day, and we will continue at 1:30 p.m. with a closing program with our co-creators of the exhibition Unnamed Figures. We're really excited to have them together back again with us. And again, thank you for our panelists this morning. It was a fabulous start to the day. And I see you in 30 minutes. Thank you.